Today, we are thrilled to talk about the 2020 economic outlook, a macroeconomic perspective. We have two fantastic professors with us today, both named Bill, from the University of Texas at Arlington. A little bit about UTA. UTA is a R1 research institution, according to the Carnegie Institute, and they have hit record enrollments over the past few years. It is the largest university in North Texas and in the UT system. So we are thrilled to have them here with us today. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. His name is Dr. Bill Seeger. So he is a clinical professor of economics at UTA and is the director of the corporate education program. He received his PhD in policy economy from UT Dallas in 1988, and he joined UTA in 2017 after a 20-year career in public accounting and as a tax partner at the International Tax and Transfer Pricing Practice. He teaches managerial economics and transfer pricing economics at the grad and undergrad levels. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Seeger.
Well, thank you, Britton. It's a great thrill to be here. And speaking for Bill and myself, we have done other chamber activities, and we both really enjoy appearing in any capacity and teaming with the chamber. So thank you once again. My honor and privilege to introduce my colleague, and I'll be, so the audience knows, I'll be firing questions at Bill Crowder, my colleague, and he'll provide all the insights and correct answers to all these macro issues that all of your audience are thinking about.
And I did forget to mention that our audience, if you do have questions, we will wait till there's a lull and we will ask them to our two speakers today. So feel free to shout those questions out via Facebook when you're listening, and then we'll make sure to interject them in at the appropriate point in the conversation.
Perfect. Well, some background on Bill Crowder, Professor Crowder. Now, his PhD in economics from Arizona State in 1992, and he also received the William Barchelon Prize for Outstanding Graduate Student in Economics. He joined UTA in September of '92, and he has published numerous articles in academic journals. His area of expertise is in macroeconomics, international finance, and what's called time series econometrics. That is, if he has to forecast what's happening in the economy, that's the kind of statistics he uses to come up with his insights and forecasts. So not only an economist, but a statistician as well. Professor Crowder is also awarded the Distinguished Research Publication Award for the College of Business at UTA in 1997 and 1999. And he teaches macroeconomics, money and banking, and time series econometrics at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. And I must say, he is a great colleague as well, a fine person. So with that, that's my intro for Bill. And let me welcome Dr. Crowder. Hello, Bill.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it'll be great to get your insights and input on all these questions of the day. And I thought what we do is just to get you warmed up a little bit. I'd ask you a few general questions. And then we can get right into kind of outlook and macro and that sort of thing. And then if time permits, we're going to talk a little bit about the Texas economy as well. So one thing that we're all experiencing, Bill, is working from home and being online and being virtual. And I just wondered if you thought that was going to be the new normal going forward. And if so, how might that affect the economy and the macro economy, maybe in terms of productivity, for example? What are your thoughts on kind of teaching classes remotely?
Well, I mean, obviously this is impacting all of us. It's yet to be seen exactly how it's going to impact productivity. I've heard some analyses that have been done recently that say that working from home has actually boosted productivity a little bit. But again, that's something that's yet to be seen. Clearly, though, if the work from home trend is going to continue, this is going to impact commercial real estate dramatically. So, I mean, if you're looking for one industry that's going to be very largely impacted by a work from home push or trend over time, it would be the commercial real estate. There's just no justification for spending a lot of money on office space if your workers can do their job just as well from their home remotely.
I wanted to get your take a little bit on the struggle of government responding to the pandemic. We've seen in the news that there's been various responses across countries by various governments, some good, not so good. So I'll propose a hypothetical to you. If you got a call from the president in a week or so saying, what do you advise in case we have something like this happen again, so we're either prepared or can respond more effectively? What kind of advice would you give?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's way too general of a question for a guy like me to answer. Look, the health aspects of it are way outside of my area of expertise, so I'll leave that to somebody else to discuss. Look, I think one of the things that in general, after this is settled down and we get to some semblance of normality, we are going to have to rethink our sort of globalized economic relationships. The pandemic was caused by, without putting too fine a point on it, our international connections. And so we have to recognize that there are huge benefits to a globalized economy, the trade benefits, the efficiency gains that economists talk about, but those have to be weighed against these other costs that now we're bearing. And those other costs are things that economists have not really thought much about for the last 100 years. Mm-hmm. And certainly we haven't been measuring them and including them in our modeling. And so, again, we're going to be thinking going forward economics in terms of the economy. We're going to be rethinking, I think, a lot of the benefits that we thought we were getting from globalization. We're going to have to start measuring the costs of that as well.
Great. I'm sure you're getting the question since you are a professor. What's the impact of all this on higher education? So what are your views? How will this impact higher education going forward?
Well, my view on it is much like my view on the general economy, not that they're the same, but so much of my expectations depends on what happens with the course of the virus itself. So in some sense, what happens with the economy and all the rest of it is almost completely dependent on how the virus and what we learn about it. So for example, if we learn ultimately that the mortality rate associated with the virus is significantly lower than what we originally thought, which motivated the shutdown, then that will probably augur a more robust recovery. On the other hand, if we find out that there will be several waves of these intense hospitalizations and sicknesses, well, that in itself then could be very detrimental to getting the economy fully recovered. So going back to the higher education question, so much of what happens to higher education in this regard is going to depend on what happens with our battle against the virus itself. But I suspect that, first of all, many higher education institutions were already financially strapped for this. That's true, of course, of lots of businesses as well and other institutions. So one of the things that these kinds of economic shocks does is it has the effect of shaking out the weakest players in each of these sectors of the economy, and higher education is no different. I've read some estimates that by within the next 5 years, up to 10% of all higher education institutions will disappear. They'll just go out of business, and we've already seen about 3 or 4 declare bankruptcy just in the last month. So again, these are smaller, mostly private liberal arts colleges at this point. But so much of the effect on higher education is going to depend on the path of the virus. And my suspicion is that as of right now, we're at UTA and considering how UTA is going to respond to this. And I suspect as of right now, we're going to be online in the fall.
Great. Well, thank you.
That's not official, by the way, so don't
run
around and quote me, but that's my suspicion. That's my expectation given how things are shaking out right now.
Well, I'm going to move into some macro questions now after some of those general questions. And some of what you're going to tell us about macroeconomics and, unemployment and GDP and, inflation or deflation probably depends a bit on your personal view about when the economy will open up again. So on your last point, do you expect the economy to be fully open, I don't know, by the end of the summer? I was just curious to get that before I asked you these other macro issues.
It's, that obviously is the $1 million question. It's more than $1 million. It's trillions of dollars at stake. And I just don't know the answer. As I said, the answer to that completely depends on the health outcome aspects of this. And I'm not an expert in that area. And to some degree, just like everyone else, I have to rely on what the experts are telling us. It is a little problematic, I think, that we're finding it difficult to get consistent information about some of these things, right, in terms of the health aspects. But be that as it may, I think a lot of that will be resolved in the fullness of time as we learn more about it. But again, my expectation of when we're going to open up, if I were, I guess, the one making the decision, I'd start opening up the areas that are not, dramatically impacted by the outbreaks right now. In some sense, I'm not on a cost benefit analysis. And that's, again, what economists really do is we are cost benefit analyzers. It doesn't really make sense to shut down Missoula, Montana for a serious outbreak that's occurring in New York City or New Orleans or Detroit or wherever it happens to be occurring. Now, that said, the way the virus is transmitted has implications for opening up, and I'm not even sure that we're completely settled on how that occurs, although we're learning more and more. I do believe that when we do open up, we're going to have to establish a sort of a set of new normals, just like we did post 9/11 in terms of air travel, right? We all sort of gotten used to, we've all adapted to the new costs of air travel since 9/11. And I think that's probably what's going to happen in the economy is that, for example, things like the N95 masks will have to be made so ubiquitous, so available that they're the equivalent of paper towels or napkins.
Right.
Toilet paper in a public restroom or something. In other words, you should be able to just walk into a public facility and grab a new N95 mask off the dispenser and put it on, because that's going to be how ubiquitous and necessary they may be for a while. So it's things like that I think are ultimately how are we going to respond to that. And look, one of the things about these kinds of very dramatic shocks to the economy is they have high costs, but there's also huge opportunities for people that are, clever and entrepreneurial and can figure out how to meet these new demands and can predict, how these markets are going to, move in one direction or the other.
How, in your view, and I've been asked this question a lot, how does what we're going through now with the pandemic crisis differ from the financial crisis of 2007?
Yeah, it's one of these things where they're completely different animals in some regard, even though they both impact the economy. I was thinking about what is a good analogy to describe what we were going through, and perhaps maybe the best analogy is to think of riding in a race car, and our economy is the race car, and we're all passengers in this race car, and we had that economy revved up. We had it really going 120 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden, somebody hit the brakes. So, right, some of us are going to fly through the window, some of us are going to get smashed up inside. So I guess the issue is that's sort of the damage that we're experiencing right now with the shutdown, is that we hit the brakes on this. And unfortunately, that's where my analogy sort of loses its steam, because indeed, an economy is really not like a machine. assuming we didn't damage the race car engine, we could turn the engine back on and start it right back up and be at 120 lickety split. But unfortunately, an economy is not like that. It's organic. It's biological in that sense. It's because it's based on human beings, and it's much more like thinking of taking your plants in your greenhouse, and they're normally used to getting, 12 hours of sunlight a day. Well, now you've had to cover the greenhouse and not allow sunlight in except maybe 1 hour a day. Now try to predict when your greenhouse will come back and be flourishing. It's right. It's a very difficult. It's much more akin to that of trying to bring back dormant life than it is to switching on a machine. Right, and so how does it differ from the 2008, 2009 is that this is largely what I would call an aggregate supply shock, right? This is essentially reducing our ability to produce output, right? It's not like we don't want the output. It's not like the demand isn't there for the output. We're all wanting to buy all of these great things, but we can't do it now because of what the virus has done to the economy. Again, what are the implications of that? Well, when there's an aggregate supply shock, I think that this is, a much more, but of course less dramatic episode that would be analogous to the one we're going through would be the oil shocks of the 1970s, right? In which we were so dependent on foreign oil back then that when the OPEC countries embargoed the United States and oil prices shot up, that constrained our economy's ability to produce output. That was a supply shock. And in some sense, it's a very similar situation today. And so what I expect to probably be happening is something similar to what happened in the 70s, but probably dramatically worse, unfortunately, is the stagflation that we observe. That is stagnant output. In fact, output clearly is going to be falling. The negative GDP growth over the next quarter or so is going to be staggering. It's going to be really a shock to see what those final numbers are. But again, I'm kind of getting long-winded here, Bill, so I'm going to wrap it up there and just say that the economy itself is much more like an organic, like a garden or something like that, and bringing it back isn't just a matter of flipping on a switch.
So, I think you made a great point that it's similar in that supply shock, except this time it wasn't OPEC that is affecting the economy. In effect, the government, because of their virus, had to shutter the economy, as they say, and that probably then leads to an understanding of why the government is now really obligated to, regardless of your political stripe, to support the economy. Right? It was shut down. I'm gonna back off on that a little bit because see one of the problems is, and this is a philosophical issue as much as anything else, but this is this kind of negative shock, right? This kind of negative event that impacts everyone. First of all, I'm not sure that it's the government's role to insure all of us against the impacts of these types of shocks, which it seems like what the government's trying to do. It's trying to essentially provide an insurance payment to all of us to soften the blow. Right. I'm not sure that's the role of government, and more importantly, when the shock is so widespread, when it affects everybody in the way that it has, I'm not sure it's even possible to do that. Mm-hmm. So that said, though, I understand why the government has behaved so dramatically. I understand why the Fed is acting so aggressively in financial markets. One of the things that happened, this is one of the things I teach my students in money and banking, is that during the Great Depression, the Fed messed up badly. And the long story short is that during the Great Depression, the Fed should have been counteracting a decline in what we call the money multiplier by expanding the monetary base, but they didn't. And as a consequence, the entire money supply in the economy contracted, and that made what should have been just a regular recession into, up until now, the worst economic outcome that the United States had ever had. So the Fed is aggressively trying to avoid that kind of mistake. So we're not going to make those kinds of mistakes and make this situation worse. But there are sort of limits, and I think
we should recognize that there are limits to how much ability the government has to, as I said, insure us against the bad outcomes here. Again, it's something we should consider. Before this happened in 2019, official numbers aren't finished yet, but our real GDP is going to come in somewhere around $22 trillion for 2019. But that's also the level of our government debt, federal debt, at the end of 2019. So we were at 100% of GDP at the end of 2019 in December. Well, with all of this now, the government's going to borrow upwards of $7 trillion this year. So our debt now is going to go to $29 trillion. But our GDP this year, 2020, is probably going to be on the order of $16 trillion.
Right.
So again, our ability to keep adding more and more debt is going to quickly run out. And so again, I worry about that.
Right. I wanted to ask, in your view, if we really have any choice in that, don't we need to get people back to work, and then we can worry about the debt overhang, later on as we kind of work through it.
I do, and I understand the thinking. In fact, originally, when I thought this was only going to be a few weeks long, back when my colleagues and I thought, oh, well, in 6 weeks we'll get over the hump and we'll be back to normal, I was thinking, yes, let's just sort of freeze the economy in place, and the government can just essentially guarantee everybody's payments for 4 weeks. Yeah. It turns out, though, that given how things have worked out, that's just not possible. And again, so it's I understand this idea that we want to keep people alive, right? We want to make sure that people are going by the time I understand that. And so it's my considerations are not about that. My considerations are about the economy overall, right? And so you can make an argument, a humanitarian argument, and I'm not going to disagree with you. But as an economist, I'm concerned because the reality is that the government is really good at wasting resources. And when they're opening up a fire hose of $7 trillion, as they basically have, I really get concerned about the resources that are being wasted. And again, there are like troubling signs to me right now. For example, one of them is that the stock market's only down 10% off of its all-time high. I'm not sure how that can be justified with the sort of economic carnage that we've been warned is on the way. So it appears again that there's some sort of disconnect there, and so there may be something I'm missing, and I would really appreciate if somebody would let me know what that is.
So I guess in a scorecard sense, to summarize, I mean, the government is doing, and the Fed, because they're working hand in hand, they're doing what they have to do. But I think, is your point, we're realizing pretty quickly that the magnitude of the problem is such is that, we can't float the economy indefinitely.
Exactly. That's exactly my point, is that there are limits to how much we can borrow from the future. And that's exactly what we're doing right now, right? This is all borrowing. We're basically taking from future production. We're drawing it to today to help us smooth out, ride out this really bad downturn. And that makes perfect sense. But again, the government's doing things in its effort to mitigate or minimize our pain that's actually working against that happening. Just as an example, normally we would expect in such an economic environment that households would want to be borrowing right now because they're out of work, they have expenses, and we would expect then that increase in borrowing would ultimately lead to an increase in interest rates. Now, I know that might sound like a bad idea, but it's the increase in interest rates that signals to the savers, the people that might have money to lend, hey, now I'm ready to lend. Now it's time for me to lend, right? And when the Fed suppresses the signal that particular price in the market is sending, again, it has reverberations throughout the economy and its ability to recover.
Yeah, I think the point you make is very interesting, and it goes back to fundamentals, right, of trade-offs, the present versus the future.
Yes, and that's it. And again, we're in a bad situation, so I have no problems justifying saying, yes, we should be borrowing from the future and drawing it to today to help smooth out our consumption stream. That's exactly perfectly rational behavior to do. The problem is the devil's in the details, as they say, right? The implementation matters, right? Just as an example, my wife owns a small business and was completely shut out of the PPP funding, right? And we all have read the stories on why. And that's, that's one sort of microeconomic example of the kind of macro problem that I'm pointing to, which is this money's getting fired out, and when the way we're doing it, we're really not sure if it's going to beneficial uses, which it was intended to, or if it's just being stolen, right? We just don't know.
Well, let me take you to from the present maybe to a turnaround. If maybe the bottom is now, or maybe it was December of 19. Do you think we're in a recession now? And when will we come out of it? Not because I'm going to ask you a separate question about when are we going to get back to the peak of where we were? Okay, pre-COVID. So I have two questions. Are we in a recession now, and when will that end? And then a follow-up to that will be, when will we get back to the pre-COVID peak again?
So again, these are just my opinion. Okay. First of all,
yes.
Technically, a recession requires 2 negative quarters of GDP growth, right? 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth. We haven't had enough time pass. But that aside, for all practical purposes, we are in a recession. We're in a very, very deep recession. Again, we'll know more in a month, and we'll know even more again in 2 months after that about the impact, the total. Essentially a bomb went off. The dust is still flying. We don't have the ability yet to measure how deep the hole that the bomb created is. We just don't know that yet, right? And so that's going to take time for us to figure out. So when does this recession end? Again, if the virus gets settled, if the virus issues get settled, I think by the fall we'll be coming back out of it. We could be growing again. Now, when do we get back to the peak in December or January of 2019? That's a good question, because look, so much of it depends on not government anymore, but individuals' expectations and individual attitudes, right? And so to what degree, as we open the economy back up, is our experience, there's not much disease and there's not much infection, and therefore we gain more confidence in our ability to exchange together, to interact, right? Or do we go through this second wave that I've heard talk about, right? That comes, and then believe even paranoid. So again, it's a very difficult balancing act. That's just what life is too, right? I mean, in some sense, that's really what it is. It's literally about, and the beauty, what I love about economics is we've learned the secret as economists, and we try to share it with everyone. The secret is, of course, marginal cost equals marginal benefit. Right. And that's where the decision should come down to. So it's hard, but we've got to try to get measures of what the marginal cost of opening up would be in terms of the spread of the infection and maybe a second wave, versus the marginal benefits of an economy expanding and creating jobs. And again, we should recognize that people are dying because of lost jobs, because of lost income, because of shut down hospital systems and healthcare systems. So people are dying because of the shutdown. And again, it only makes sense to try to sort of include that as part of the cost of whatever we're measuring.
Very good. I'm wondering if I might summarize, or have you summarize in a moment, but I was going to fire a few questions like a macro scorecard, just quickly on some of the aggregates that our audience may be interested in. So, in general, where do you think unemployment rates are going to go for this year and for 2021?
That's, again, I'm only guessing. Any number that I throw out is really going to be speculative. I'm going to tell you that people shouldn't be shocked. I read that the consensus estimate for tomorrow's new unemployment claims is 5 million. So if we get 5 million new claims tomorrow, that will be over 30 million people filing new unemployment claims in the last 5 weeks. Our entire workforce, the entire labor force of the U.S. economy is only about 170 million people. So you're talking about, 20%, close to 20, right? Close, something like that of the entire U.S. economy out of work. So so let's say 20% unemployment rate. And we're talking depression level unemployment rates. Now, will those persist? That's maybe the bigger question, right? Because that's what happened during the Great Depression, is that lasted. It kept going and going. 20%, 25% unemployment for month after month after month. That's the real question. And of course, that the only answer to that question is what happens to this. In other words, do we learn enough about the virus that we realize, for example, that this has been a gross overreaction and we should never shut down the economy and we should just go ahead and adapt to whatever health issues arise with our functioning economy? Or are we going to learn about the virus that, in fact, for example, what I've been reading, some of the things is that having contracted it provides no immunity. In other words, you can contract it again. And if that's the case, right, and again, if the health impacts of contracting it over and over or severe or whatever, in other words, there's so much we don't know about the virus itself that it's impossible really to predict how the economy is going to respond.
Right. What about, you had mentioned a bit about inflation. What is your view on inflation? You think it'll rear its ugly head in here anytime soon?
It's kind of a running joke among macroeconomists. Where's the inflation, right? Not just now, but where has it been the last 20 years? I actually at UTA, he's since retired, Rick Wilson, very popular instructor in the department, and he was a firm believer in monetarism, which is money supply. Look at money supply, and that tells you what's going to happen to inflation. Well, money supply has been, as we all know, has been growing like crazy for the last 2 decades, essentially, yet no inflation. So I would love to, I don't know, love is the right word, but I wish I were confident in saying to you, yes, I expect higher inflation. I mean, it stands to reason that all of this money flowing into the economy from the government, from the Fed, and our productive capacity has shrunk. So in other words, supply is going to decline, but demand seems to be holding. And given that, I got to believe, yes, we're going to see higher inflation. But again, I've been, like many macroeconomists, I've been predicting higher inflation for a long time, and we just have not seen it.
Interest rates now and then for 2021. Are they going to stay near zero? Or
yeah, I mean, I think the Fed's made it clear what their policy is, right? Is that they're simply going to provide whatever liquidity they think is demanded. And, it's sort of I don't know how to, maybe it's sort of a shoot first and ask questions later, right? In other words, make loans first and then determine later if they were really the right loans to make. Again, it's difficult to be critical in a crisis, right? People aren't that concerned about those issues. Again, I suspect that the Fed I know that the Fed has announced that they don't want to go into negative interest rate territory like the European Central Bank and the Bank of Japan. The experiences of both of those economies from that does not appear to be good. And there's lots of reasons we can sort of understand why. But more importantly, I think that, again, the Fed, if we look at where interest rates arguably should have been, there's a principle called the Taylor Rule, named after John Taylor, the economist at Stanford. It essentially tells you what the Fed's policy interest rate, the federal funds rate, should be given the conditions in the economy. Well, that Taylor Rule, what the Fed should have set the funds rate, has been significantly higher than what it has been for over a decade. And it just suggests that, again, what I was saying earlier is that the Fed, by keeping interest rates at zero essentially for so long, they've in some sense distorted the lending markets. In other words, guys like me who might be lenders are like, I've got to go seek higher return elsewhere, right? I can't afford now to just put my money in a safe asset like you could in a previous generation. You've got to take on risk to get even a marginal rate of return. So the point I'm making, though, is that these distortions have consequences, and I think, again, we need to be cognizant of them, especially at the policy level. It may be so much that business people need to be cognizant of it, but certainly the policymakers, I have to really understand that keeping interest rates low for this long has some negative consequences. It's going to create imbalances in the system. And so, but my prediction is that they're going to continue the policy.
And what about a lot of our listeners here have to do some forecasting, and they'll be concerned with GDP growth. You expect it just to be negative this year, and you think it can get back to 1.5 or 2% for 2021?
Well, again, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to see the worst GDP growth in U.S. history. That's already baked in, right? So we're going to see a decline in GDP. Again, I don't really know what the number's going to be. 20, 30%, something like that. It's going to be absolutely, something we've never even thought about. How quickly will we grow back? Again, that depends on so many factors that we've already talked about. One of them we haven't talked about, for example, is the regulatory state, right? The regulatory structure. Again, one of the reasons that we were so ill prepared for testing, just as an example, with this virus, was that the regulators at the CDC, right, were so inured to their rules and their system that they couldn't adapt to the emergency. And so, long story short, we don't have enough tests, or we didn't have enough tests. I guess that's changing now. But the point I'm making is that, again, we don't have institutions in place that are flexible and adaptable right now. We have institutions that are rigid, and they don't seem to be able to see past the particular rule in place. And so, if that's the case, that's going to slow down whatever recovery goes forward, right? We're going to have to take a different approach, I think, in which we're going to have to take a much more lighter regulatory footprint and allow entrepreneurs to operate within a dramatically sort of freer market space. Because, again, I think that what's going to be sort of key to this is individual entrepreneurial behavior. Corporations aren't going to be able to go out and solve our unemployment problem going forward by going out and hiring 50,000 new workers and putting them all in a factory now, right? That's just not going to be what's going to happen. Right. Going forward, the solution is going to be individuals creating their own little small businesses in which they're performing a service or producing some output or something like that. Again, you can see that there's going to, in the future, be an industry that will do nothing but provide the N95 masks, right? That industry will grow up in the United States, and so again, there are lots of opportunities in these types of unsettling situations.
So, Bill, I would like to leave some time for questions, and so let me just ask you to summarize briefly, with some final comments in any area in particular. But particularly if your personal view is something else we could be doing besides what we're doing now, it'd be great to hear from you. But go ahead and summarize.
Well, I was just going to, before you open up to questions, I was just going to say a little bit about the Texas economy, since we focused mostly. Since we focused mostly on sort of the national economy. Unfortunately, look, Texas was really in a beautiful position. We were in a strong national economy, and Texas was arguably the strongest state economy of that strong national economy. Texas had so much going for it before this COVID hit. But one of the problems, of course, and I think we're all sort of familiar with what's happened to the oil market, that's absolutely devastating for Texas, right? The gas and oil industry is by far the largest contributor to state GDP. I shouldn't say by far, but it's again, when you look at the graphs, you can see that industry is critically important for the Texas economy. And again, that industry is going to be devastated by the current pricing in the oil market. And so, that's going to disproportionately impact Texas. So you might argue that the Texas economy sort of led the pack as the nation was growing. It might be the case, unfortunately, that Texas might sort of lead the pack in the downturn right now. We might actually feel the brunt of it worse than other economies might. Yeah. Again, to be seen, right? We'll see what happens. It may be that the Texas oil producers can adapt to the new pricing environment. Let me say one other thing before you open it up to questions, general audience, is that I am very optimistic long term about the U.S. economy, because the U.S. finds itself in a unique position relative to any other country in the world. We're the only nation in the world that is now completely energy independent and completely food independent. So again, worst case scenario, the United States is going to do better than many other countries. And so from that perspective, we have a firm foundation from which to build on. This is a strong economy. It's a strong country. So again, I'm very optimistic longer term in that regard.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Your comments were great. And if Britton is still there, we could open it up to questions, Britton.
I am still here, both of you. That was riveting conversation. I was taking an aggressive amount of notes, and I know that our attendees of the event today are watching as well. We didn't see any questions come in initially, so we're going to see if people chime in here towards the end. But since you did mention the food independence of our country, one question that has come up, and I'm sure you've heard it in the news, is the fact that our food has been impacted with the outbreak of COVID-19. Do you see that playing a negative impact on the economy?
Well, sure, of course it is. I mean, but understand, I think people should understand what's going on, like with the meatpacking plant shutting down. Here's the problem is that, again, when the economy is fully functioning, when we're on a roll, go back to December 2019, meat packers, the chicken producers, right? They're producing what we might think of as sort of a constant flow of, numbers of cattle, numbers of chickens that are, 10 million a month, let's say, whatever it is. All of a sudden now, boom, we're not out buying that much food. We're sort of all in lockdown. We're not going to restaurants. We're not. So what's happened is the demand for their goods has dropped off to the point where they are going to have to stop producing at that level. But because we're talking about growing animals, getting back up to full production again once the economy recovers, that's going to take time. That's going to take months, in fact, right? The thing here is effectively not that we're going to necessarily starve or anything like that. It's just that cull their herds right now. They're going to have to reduce the size of their livestock to be consistent with the current demand. And then once demand rises, they'll be able to build up their livestock, but that will take time. That will take months to do. But that goes back to this idea that I made earlier, which is that the economy is organic in that way. You can't just snap a finger or turn on a switch and get everything to bloom and to get everything to grow, because it takes time. And so that's just one good example.
We had a fantastic question come in from one of our viewers today. It's, do you see a significant onshoring of manufacturing going forward?
I do. I think one of the results of this is going to be that people are going to be willing to pay a little bit higher price to buy American. I think that what you're going to see over time is, I think you're going to see this idea that, look, there is no doubt that we in the United States have benefited dramatically from the globalization that has occurred over the last 30 years. We get goods that are cheap, right? The prices are very low, and therefore low prices means we can consume a lot more of them, and we have, and we've benefited from that. But now we're realizing that there are other costs to globalization that we didn't consider. Confronted with these new costs to globalization, again, like anything, we want the costs and benefits to balance. So we're going to start to realize that indeed the benefits to globalization are probably not as dramatically positive as we had been led to believe. And so I believe we're going to see more onshoring. I definitely see more supply chains moving out of China. Again, just out of the sort of the economics realm, geopolitical, clearly China is going to be kind of a worldwide pariah for some time, given how we're learning more and more and how this all came about. And so I do believe that you're going to also see more supply chains moving out of China to other competing countries, Vietnam, India, Indonesia. So I think that process is going to accelerate. And yes, I do think there's going to be more onshoring. But let me say that the onshoring that will occur, it won't produce, I think, a dramatic increase in, let's say, blue collar or manufacturing. Because when we bring back manufacturing, those new factories that are going to be built are going to be mainly robots. They're going to be automated to using the most latest technology available, and so they're not going to be the assembly line kind of factories that we have of old. And so, although it will bring back, that won't be the primary reason we're doing it, because it's bringing jobs back. It's because we realize that the cost of allowing, for example, our pharmaceutical production to occur overseas just exceeds the low cost benefit that we thought we were getting.
So the next question that came is, what book would you recommend to understand about future economy trends?
Oh my gosh.
If you want to get back to us later, we will let our viewers know.
Let me do some research on that in email, because the truth is the last few months I have been scrambling to put my classes online, and I have not been doing any sort of pleasure reading or just reading for interest in that regard. So I'll tell you, a great book to always read for economics is Atlas Shrugged. So.
And then we had an additional question come in, because we do know that Boeing does make up a huge chunk of our GDP. They are a big player. So this viewer wanted to know what commercial aviation will look like.
Again, it's there are certain industries that are really going to undergo a very dramatic change. 9/11 was an earthquake for the airline industry. So, and this one's even bigger. It's even so. I don't know. I sit around talking to my wife about what's going to happen with Disney World. How is Disney World ever going to reopen in the conditions that it is? How are airlines going to go back to normal? And perhaps there may be an angle to this that Boeing benefits. So, for example, flights now, because of social distancing, what a plane that carried 300 people can now only 75. That means airlines are going to have to fly more planes. And so Boeing might be able to sell more planes in the future as a consequence to this. Again, these are the kinds of opportunities, though, that again, I'm not saying that's what is going to happen, but it's potentially what will happen. And so, again, it's difficult to predict exactly what will happen to Boeing. But again, clearly travel-related industries, group entertainment. We've got two beautiful billion-dollar sports facilities right in the middle of Arlington, and for all we know, maybe neither of them will ever be used again.
So speaking of that, which we do hope they'll be used again.
Yes, we do.
They will be used again.
I desperately want to see the Rangers in that new ballpark.
So we had another question on this, in which we'll take this as I have one more additional question for you, but I do know that you all have other things to do, which is, many communities throughout North Texas have strong connections with the arts and entertainment industry, example, performing arts, sports, etc. What is your sense as to the ripple effect physical distancing will have on local economies if we are not able in the same place at the same time?
It's such a great question, because it hits on parts of our industry or parts of our economy that a lot of economists don't think about much. But I think this is going to affect arts, like performing arts, movies, as we said, sporting events. It's going to affect this, I think, in much the same way, or at least in a similar magnitude that the internet affected these things. Again, prior to the internet, we bought our music on discs and on tapes, and we went into theaters to watch movies. Now with the internet, we stream everything. We use MP3s for our music, and so I think, again, what is that human beings want this form of output, right? We want art, we want entertainment, we want culture, and we'll adapt. We'll find a way so that concerts will still occur, but it won't be in a concert chamber full of people. It'll be a concert chamber in which perhaps all the individual players in the orchestra are in their own home, and somehow electronically we're able to listen to a concert live as each of them plays sort of independently. Again, technology and human ingenuity will find a way so that those kinds of things will survive.
That's a fantastic answer, and thank you much. The last question we always like to ask our viewers, which this applies to both of you, you can both answer this, is what is your message to the small business as we move forward through this pandemic?
Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, the small business community is, obviously being hit than bigger corporations due to cash flow, et cetera. And I think what they're, gonna have to do is just persevere as well as they can through this crisis and take advantage of any kind of government help that they can get. And it probably is the case, as Bill has been mentioning, we've got a lot of reserves built up in the banking system. So there's a lot of money to be sought after for loans, et cetera. So this is the right time to try and access. But anything you could do within the realm of reason to stay afloat, I would do it. I do think we're gonna recover, and I have a strong belief in our entrepreneurship ability of our small business to deal with this crisis. Difficult, but you have to stay the course. What do you say, Bill?
Yeah, no, I think that's unfortunately all sort of swimming in the same pool here, and we're not quite seeing what's going on. And what I would just say for the business community in general is that you've got to try to pay attention to what's going on. You have to try to determine how the events are going to impact your specific business, and then you're going to have to I go back to the same story. You're going to have to weigh costs and benefits and decide whether or not it's worthwhile to try to stick this out or conserve your resources for an attempt to start a business once the full recovery begins. It's very difficult. It's as I said before, right, the recovery itself will be largely driven by small business. So in that regard, obviously, I'm an advocate, but again, I think we also need to be realistic. These are going to be hard times for a while, and I think Bill's right. Find the resources that you can find, stay above water if that's what you think is the best move, and again, in time, as the old saying goes, this too will pass.
Thank you so much to the two of you for joining us today. We truly appreciate you being here and providing a look and being honest with us about what we see coming forward for the rest of 2020 and the beginning of 2020. We also appreciate all of you that stayed along for the entire ride for this fantastic webinar. Thank you for your continued support of the Greater Arlington Chamber of Commerce. Tomorrow, we will be detouring topics completely and talking about intentionality in leadership and how you have to choose to invest in your own potential and choose to grow as a leader. So it'll be a fantastic conversation. Make sure to tune in tomorrow at 1 p.m. on our Facebook channel. So thank you again to everyone for joining us. Stay safe, and remember, together we succeed. Have a great day.